You have recently traveled to both Europe and also China, and you live in the United States. So you kind of have seen where everything stands more or less currently in person with your own eyes. And of course, when you're traveling, you don't get to really dig in deep and analyze absolutely everything, but you could make some basic observations. You cover all of this on a day-to-day basis. So how about you start where you are right now? You're on the East Coast in the United States, in New York. How are things there? How are things in Europe and then China? And then we can backtrack and ask some questions and explore all of this in more depth. Go ahead.
Thanks. Well, thanks again for having me on, Brian. Earlier, there was many different versions of our video playing, so apologies if it took a little while for me to respond. I had to close all these windows. But in terms of the situation in New York and really the United States in general, I think it really depends on who you ask, because if you are a major executive, if you are within this top 1% of income and wealth owners in the United States, you're doing quite well. Profit margins are quite high, and you do not feel the effects of the economic crisis as much as maybe the rest of us. But there are a lot of problems right now occurring in the United States, not least of which is you go outside on any given day, especially on the East Coast, and you might be breathing in Canadian wildfire smoke, which I was today. And it's very, let's just say, very alarming to the body. But in other respects, I mean, the crisis economically is very much apparent, but also very much ignored by the political class. So on the one hand, you have the Biden administration talking about things going better, inflation going down, jobs going up. But I think for the vast majority of people, the economic situation is a driving force for a lot of the dissatisfaction that exists in the United States with just day-to-day life. So inflation is actually still very high, basically in all areas, but housing tends to be the worst. And then, of course, we talk about this a lot, Brian. The overall stagnation of the West is really felt, I think, the hardest in the United States, because you have, on the one hand, declining infrastructure, declining economic living standards, and on the other, you have a situation where not many people expect anything better. So you're not going to have a large protests like you see in Prague against NATO, or even in France with these riots and You're not going to have any kind of bursts of anger, because I think people expect, for the most part, that their government won't serve them to any degree. And so I think that's where things stand in the United States. There is a lot of discontent and disillusionment, and it's not clear where it will go politically. But most people are sick and tired of being sick and tired, being literally sick, the society making them sick, the economic living standards making them sick, and making them poorer and poorer. And also, I think that there is a lot of, while most people ignore this in their day-to-day lives, I think a lot more people are seeing that foreign policy quagmires like Ukraine are becoming increasingly untenable. And there is this disconnect between people's lives and how things are not getting better, and the fact that their government, that tends to take a lot of tax dollars and tends to ignore the needs of ordinary people, seems to have unlimited resources for imperial ventures abroad. And so I think that is almost like an unspoken but recognized situation that is not that has not yet been felt politically, but it will be, I believe.
Now, you said about infrastructure neglect, and this is going to be important because I want to talk about the infrastructure that you used or saw during your travels. What are some examples of infrastructure neglect in the United States? And before you go, I will say, when I left the United States, the last time I visited the U.S. and left was 2007. I took Amtrak from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast, and it was abysmal. And the trains here in Thailand are head and shoulders way better, on time, clean, functional, and it doesn't sit there in the desert for like 5 hours waiting for freight trains to go by. Amtrak does. Can you give us some other examples, Danny?
Yes, there are many examples of infrastructure neglect in the United States. When you have trillions of dollars being siphoned off by a military apparatus alone, let alone the fact that a lot of the banks, the huge banks that invest in this military apparatus, private contractors, et cetera, they are also being subsidized heavily by the U.S. government. But what isn't being subsidized, and you can see this quite clearly, is basically infrastructure across the board. So you mentioned trains. There are derailments after derailments after derailments in the United States. I think that there was just one recently, and I believe it was in the state of Pennsylvania where it happened, but I wouldn't be quoted on that. It often happens in these, this part of the country. But at the same time, or the Midwest, but at the same time, the entire Amtrak system, the train system, has been rotting essentially for decades and decades. And it's not often spoken about that the United States in and of itself really doesn't have a public transit system across the board. Some cities have one, but the vast majority of cities and states have absolutely no public transit system, which means that people must rely on cars. And then you ask, well, if you're concerned about the climate, if you're concerned about the environment, like some liberals profess they are, well, then what do you do about that? Shouldn't there be more trains or even, let's say, electric vehicles? Well, there's absolutely no investment in renewable energy or anything like that. So there is a dependency on oil and gas, and the United States happens to be now it's tried to turn itself into kind of a modern Saudi Arabia, so to speak, and become its own so-called independent energy producer. But really, all that's amounted to is no updates to infrastructure. That energy isn't going to, hey, let's renew people's homes, let's weatherize, let's modernize. It's actually just gone to big oil companies, and and those oil companies just take everything. They don't fix the roads. You go to any major city in the United States, you will see the roads have not been fixed in a very long time. And this is just the cities, let alone the rural areas of the United States, which tend to be, in terms of infrastructure, the most neglected. So no trains, roads falling apart. There are a lot of places in the United States that aren't really connected to anything in any kind of way. I was visiting the South Tennessee area recently, and there are entire communities that are just disconnected. There's not a grocery store to be found, right? Like this is how dire it can get. And you can tell that it has such a big impact without this investment in people's needs for quality food, right? We have a lot of agribusiness, but people kind of eat really poorly here, whether it's the quantity or the quality of the food that they're eating, whether it's the environment and the pollution, or whether it's the fact that the infrastructure from housing to roads to trains is either non-existent or it's very old. Everything in the United States is now aging, and the development that does occur tends to be luxury. It tends to be just for a very small segment of the population. I was watching this so-called TikTok reel recently where someone in New York City went to some place called Hudson Yards, a very nice new developed area. And he went into the new properties being developed there, and he exposed that they were completely empty because, surprise, surprise, not many people can afford $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 per month of rent, or if you're going to buy one of those places, a mortgage that will include a hefty bill, 2 million, 3, 4, 5, 6, sometimes 20 million for these kind of penthouse luxury apartments. And that's what's being built in places like New York City. It's not renewing the housing that the vast majority of people live in. And so this kind of desperate inequality is really a reflection of we talk a lot about, which is laser focus on the very narrow imperatives of a particular elite that the foreign policy initiatives that they wage are a huge part of, a huge reflection of, and it shows deeply in the neglect that happens right at home.
Yeah, and the last time I was in the U.S., I also spent some time in New York City, and I took the subway. an elevated train, and it is extremely old. And at some time, I was traveling in the middle of the day, and even then, I didn't really feel like it was safe, because you have people with mental health problems, you have people that are obviously not going to work. They're just out and about looking for trouble. And I compare that with the subway here in Bangkok, and it's extremely clean, pristine, extremely safe at all hours. I've never had any problems there. And the subway system here is constantly expanding. And in New York, it is extremely old, just like you said. And I just wonder, because now, like, maybe we should start talking about your experience in Europe, where you went, and also China, and the infrastructure and the conditions that you saw there. I mean, there are old subways elsewhere around the world that are still amazing and safe and clean. So what is the reason for New York City to have a subway system the way it does? I just don't get it.
Well, it's interesting, because if you speak to people, people who have experiences in the United States, in New York, and who live here, who might live, let's say, outside of here, it's talked about as like, this is the best that we have. And so that should give people pause about American exceptionalism, right? American exceptionalism may not be rooted so much in reality, when the best subway system you have is falling apart. I mean, it is and it's incredibly expensive. I mean, we're talking about a per ride fee of $2.75. It goes up basically a quarter to a half a dollar almost every year at this point. And let's just say that's not really adjusted for people's incomes and the way that they really depend on the subway to get to work. And it can become a hefty bill if you use it every single day, twice per day. So it's the best that the United States has. And you're right, it does have a lot of problems. And a lot of those problems that you speak of are both because the infrastructure is declining, but also because the living standards of people are declining. So the rise in mental illness, the rise in maybe the potential for crime, the rise in people's desperation, and all of that occurs because many people, feel compelled to sleep on the subway. And many people who feel like they're compelled to sleep on the subway is, I don't know how many people in the audience have attempted to do this, but it's not the most comfortable experience. And so all of that leads to a lot of social unrest and uneasiness and discomfort that is a product of this decline. But in terms of Europe, I mean, when I was in Europe, I spent 2.5 weeks. I went from London to Brussels to Berlin, and then ended in Prague. And the infrastructure, it's interesting, because coming from the United States, where there isn't really a subway system, where there isn't a high-speed rail system to any degree, Europe, if you look at Europe in a vacuum, you could go there and look at it and say, oh, well, at least they have these things. But if you are aware, like I was, about the decline, right, the post 1970s recovery of Germany and the rest of Europe from World War II did lead to a pretty significant investment in this kind of infrastructure, in rail, in high-speed rail, in public infrastructure and transportation in particular. But now, because of austerity, because of the way that these European governments have siphoned a lot of resources toward war and have essentially sold off a lot of their countries to private investors and big banks, etc., you can tell the decline. I was on 2 German trains, for example, and I know we talk a lot about Germany's subservience to U.S. diktats. Well, if you look at the way Germany's infrastructure and Brussels, I could not believe how dirty Brussels was for a European city rife with like elite tourism, people going there with money, going there for tourism. I was shocked at the level of just neglect of just basic things like cleaning up public spaces. And I actually couldn't believe that they have normalized like urinating on the side of buildings, because obviously they don't feel like people, they don't want public bathrooms, I guess, and you have to pay in Europe for the bathroom, which blew my mind. Everywhere I went in public spaces, they were asking me for €1 to go to the bathroom, and I was shocked by that, because in the United States you can barely find a place to go to the bathroom, and sometimes businesses will ask you to go, but it's like a different kind of, I don't know, a different kind of public insult, so to speak. And so, these kind of things, plus the trains in Germany, I took a few so-called high-speed rails. They went very slowly, and you could tell that there was no train staff workers, so to speak. And they had mechanical issues at times. We were literally thrown off of our train, randomly stopped we were at a random stop along the way to Cologne, and we were told we had to get off and we had to take buses. No explanation as to why we had to get off. They're just like, we're sorry, you have to get off. Take the buses that will pick you up. No buses picked us up. There was absolutely no buses. And at this particular train station, I don't even remember the location. It was some very small train stop in Germany. We were looking for people to speak to. Hey, like, what do? We need to catch the transfer. And it took us quite a while. It took us 5 to 10 minutes to find someone. And then once we did, they didn't know. And then, they did some digging. And then 2 minutes later, they were running around the station saying, go to track 3, go to track 3. Like, it's like, what kind of operation is this? And they overflow the trains. I mean, these are not necessarily like local public transit. This is a major, it's a high-speed rail. It's the equivalent of the Deutsche Bahn. It's the equivalent of traveling across countries. And we noticed that we were told to get up out of our seat because there were reservations, and they had basically packed us onto trains that were overflowed. So they would overflow the trains, and some people were forced to stand up 5 hours, 6 hours, because because of the level of disorganization and chaos. And so there was so many examples like that, and not to mention the prices of everything. So we talk a lot about the inflation. The prices of everything in Europe is just, it's out of control. It's worse than, there's a joke. There's lots of jokes about, you come to New York, you're going to go broke, like, because it's so expensive. Berlin, Prague, more expensive. And you can go out of the tourist areas, which I like to do when I'm traveling. I don't like to be in tourist traps for Westerners. I like to see what's going on in the regular parts of the, the cities where people actually do things, and the prices are not that different. And that was shocking to wonder. Like, I wondered about Prague. I'm like, people in Prague, the Czech crown, the currency exchange rate is dismal to the euro, and people are paying astronomical prices for basic things, for food, for drinks, for just day-to-day necessities. And so all of that just gave me pause about how much Europe has become completely almost like Americanized in some respects, in this way economically, that they are moving to this American model of you kind of have to pay to play. That for ordinary people, it is a lot harder, and it's going to get harder for them to live. Meanwhile, of course, we're always talking about, there's always money. There's always money for weapons or future weapons, or what have you, or investment for Ukraine and all these other far-flung wars that Europe has found themselves committed to at the behest of the U.S. And you go to Berlin, and Berlin is essentially a U.S. colony in many respects. You can see that. You can see the influence of West Berlin, and since the wall fell, you can see that influence of the United States, its military presence, its economic presence in Germany from decades, is now even more cemented. It's to the point where it's basically an English-speaking city, and it's an English-speaking city that is incredibly expensive and serves a very small number of people. And that was my experience in Europe, was recognizing that it's not just the place for tourists who want to blow a lot of money to go, but it's also a place that's increasingly difficult to just live in. And what did exist that served people is becoming, and I would talk to people. I was visiting someone in Berlin, and he said, what you experience, that's just normal. That's bad. And that's been normal for some years now, in recent years, over the last, 5 to 10.
Yeah, and I don't know if you did any digging into this, but is this just a normal process that's unfolding in you said over years? So this already seems like it's been going on for a multitude of reasons. How much do you think the current proxy war against Russia and Ukraine is having an impact on this? And more specifically, the energy prices have to be more expensive, and if the energy prices are more expensive, that is going to drive everything else up. And we've actually seen this in the Western media talking about this. I know in Germany, people are like, no, nothing has changed because the government was subsidizing that, but they can't do that forever. So did you see any evidence of that, or you really weren't able to link that with your personal experience?
Well, the costs of everything is skyrocketing, certainly related to energy prices going up. And the people I was visiting would talk about this. The big indicator, though, if you're just a person like me, like I was, going around to these cities, just trying to have a vacation. This was a vacation. China, which we'll get to, was a delegation. But when you're just, going around in traveling and just observing what's happening, you see the link most starkly politically, actually. So you can kind of make this connection from the sheer fact that if you know that living standards are worsening, inflation is going through the roof, while this Ukraine conflict is happening, you have no shortage of reminders that there is a conflict in Ukraine happening, because these governments have essentially, what they've done is they have tried to imbue almost a kind of inverted or maybe extroverted kind of patriotism, where they have slapped Ukraine flags everywhere, where they have put up propaganda. You have businesses there, and there has been some Ukrainian migration to Europe, especially from the West, and forces that particularly support the the war against Russia. And you will see on those businesses most starkly, right, like all of this propaganda, Slava Ukraini, and fascist statements like that. But the governments themselves invest a lot in just showing you there's a Ukraine flag everywhere, stand with Ukraine. You see that Brussels was maybe the biggest indicator of this, because it's a small city and you see it a lot more concentrated. But to be honest, Prague might have been the most and I'm not surprised that people in Prague are some of the angriest about this conflict, because their government in particular is not just invested in posting flags everywhere, but you will see literal propaganda around, invested in by the government, talking about support the war, support the war, support the war. In Prague, in Czech Republic, is, it is to the east of Europe. It is not, you're not necessarily in Western Europe anymore when you're in the Czech Republic. So that, I think, was one of the most disgusting things. And you could even see on just everywhere, the pro-Ukrainian forces have, they've even vandalized their own communities to just tell you how terrible Putin is. And a lot of different places, like, I would walk around and I'd be like, oh, I can't believe I have to look at this. And it would be, stencils spray painted, F Putin, F Russia, stand with Ukraine. It's everywhere. And I think it shows this. I think it really shows how effective this onslaught on the people has been, is when it's just normalized. People just go about their days surrounded by pro-Ukrainian propaganda, as if that isn't hurting them. And it is. And I think more and more people are realizing that. I don't see how you could not. It reminds me of the days after 9/11 in the United States and during the Iraq War, where you know, you would just have, you know, pro-war propaganda everywhere. They'd slap the American flag on everything and say, yeah, you know, go get them, go get the terrorists, go get the, you know, go get bin Laden, go, let's, you know, protect freedom and liberty and, you know, against Iraq and all this stuff. You would see it everywhere. You know, the number of pledges of allegiance would go way up because everyone had to be reminded how great the United States is as it was destroying these countries abroad. And it reminded me of that, to see just how deeply the pro-Ukrainian propaganda is in these European countries. It just was startling when you can compare it and match it with the fact that it's obviously having a direct impact on the social and economic and political life of these countries. Negative.
And I think there's a lot of scapegoating as well, because in the United States, this has been going on for years and years. Even when I used to live in the US, I could see the trajectory of everything. It's in a downward spiral. And I don't think that Europe was too far off from that as well, because they're connected. The US and Europe are fundamentally connected in terms of the circles of power that drive foreign and domestic policy. And the reason that they create the policy that they do is very similar. And it is parasitical, and they are taking from the people so that they can advance especially their foreign policy objectives everywhere. They're busy everywhere except with their own people at home. So I think the conflict in Ukraine is just, I mean, obviously it is going to have an impact, but they're going to use it as a scapegoat. Oh, look, everything is so bad, but it has to be bad because we have to beat Putin and the evil Russians.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.